From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. It's really an honor to be here for the closing event of the National Book Festival with Sir Salman Rushdie. So can we just get a round of applause for him before we even begin? Please, you should come up now and you can take a seat before it. Feel free to come up and take a seat. Do you want to take a seat now? Okay. I'm going to make a brief introduction and then I look forward to speaking with you. But the fatwa against Salman Rushdie once threatened to silence one of our generation's most original, prolific, and essential voices. Today, almost 2 decades after those dark years, Mr. Rushdie has not only not been silenced, he has published 6 more novels, a dazzling collection of essays, literary anthologies, and a screenplay. His latest novel is 2 years, 8 months, 28 nights, and which by the way is 1001 Nights, which he'll explain to us. And Salman Rushdie was born in 1947, weeks before the partition of India and Pakistan. 47, yeah, in the great cosmopolitan city of Bombay. He studied history at Cambridge University and worked in advertising. He published his first novel, Grimus, in 1975, but it was his second novel, Midnight's Children, that made him an international literary sensation. With the Booker Prize, he was crowned the voice of a new post-colonial generation, a writer capturing the journey of migration, globalization, and cultural transformation. I was born in a country where Mr. Rushdie's novels were explicitly forbidden, and even mentioning his name considered an act of transgression. Fortunately, my parents moved. It was my privilege to be assigned Midnight's Children as a college student at the University of Virginia. The novel changed my life, everything about how I understood South Asia and my place within it. Most importantly, it introduced me to Mr. Rushdie as a writer, not as a symbol or political football, but as a creative, extremely funny, and brilliant artist. His latest novel takes his love of imagination and epic storytelling to new heights, and it's really my honor to welcome Mr. Salman Rushdie back to Washington, D.C. So I want to begin by asking you, your last book before this was a book many people had asked you to write for many years, your memoirs of what happened in those years. Was it fun to return to fiction?
Yeah, it was a great relief. You know, I never became a writer to write about myself. When I started out, if you had said to me, would I ever write an autobiography, I would have said, absolutely not. And then I acquired an interesting life. Which, you know, most writers' lives involved sitting in rooms for long periods of time. Anyway, I knew I would at some point have to tell that story, but once it was done, I think 2 things happened. One is that I had a real desire to be as fictionally fictional as possible after several years of trying to be completely non-fictional. And the other is, I think that somehow the consequence of writing the memoir was as if I had put down a burden. You know, I felt sort of lighter. And I think this book, in a way, shows that. I think it has a kind of lightness in it, which I think is in part the consequence of having got the autobiography off my chest.
And so if I can say, I mean, this is almost an IMAX 3D spectacle of, set in New York City, of a kind of Marvel comic style War of the Worlds. It's sort of how it reads when you first start. There's a lot of amazing things happening in this book. It's ultimate fantasy.
I hope movie studios are listening to you.
But what can you tell us about your version of 1001 Nights?
Well, the 1001 Nights was just a way of thinking about it. I mean, it doesn't really have any narrative connection with the 1001 Nights. It's just that kind of story. I mean, one of the things I thought about all these so-called wonder tales in the East, which is not just the Arabian Nights. So in India, there's so many other collections. There's a wonderful collection of animal fables, the Panchtantra, and actually from Kashmir, which is where my family is originally from, there's a very large story compendium originally in Sanskrit, written by Somadeva, called The Ocean of the Streams of Story, the Katha Sarit Sagar, which is actually longer than the Arabian Nights. So there are many of these things around, and they were in many ways some of the first stories I heard and the first literature that I fell in love with, and originally heard them as children's bedtime stories. And when I grew up to read the actual books, it immediately struck me that these books were not written for children. You know, that the language in them is very complex, and the ideas in them are very complex, and they're clearly adult fiction. And that interested me in a different way. And so after finishing the memoir, I thought, in a way, I found myself circling back to that kind of origin point of the place where my interest in literature had begun. And I thought, what can I do? Is there some way that I can use that kind of storytelling, but to tell a contemporary story? You know, not to do something set in the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid or something, but to something set in New York City now. And I also wanted to do another thing, which is that I'm also very interested in a kind of Western surrealist tradition. You know, and there are so many writers in so many different languages who have all written in a kind of non-naturalistic way. I mean, you know, you could say that Kafka is a magic realist, you know, and in Russia, Gogol and Bulgakov, and then of course there's the French surrealists and so on. And I've always been very interested in that. So I thought, what would happen if I allow this Eastern tradition of the fantastic to collide with a Western tradition of the fantastic? You know, what would that look like? And I guess the answer is this book.
And the result are genies invading New York City.
Yeah, that's the high concept. You know, in Hollywood, in Hollywood, you have to be able to say it in 10 words or less. And that's high concept.
Okay.
So the high concept of this is, yeah, genies take Manhattan. 3 words.
But, you know, you said something interesting about, while it's not obviously your version of Arabian Nights, it does have in common that storytellers are often central characters in your books. And in this one especially, it's not just the story of the book, but there are many, many layers of stories within that story. And you've said that you feel in the Western tradition, literature and storytelling became separated at some point.
Well,
Can you talk about that idea?
There was a thing that happened in the I guess, and this is very simplifying it, but there's a thing that happened around 100 years ago in the modernist movement, where people became so interested in form and language and, you know, doing new things with those, that the narrative aspect became less significant. You know, and I mean, one of the books I admire above almost all other books is Joyce's Ulysses. And Joyce's Ulysses is crowded with stories. I mean, it's got stories on every page. But the actual narrative of the book, I mean, almost nothing happens. You know, Jewish advertising salesman walks around Dublin for the day, getting a little drunk, you know, lusting after girls on the beach, ends up in the red light district, where he runs into a young writer who's also drunk and takes him home for a drink. And in the meanwhile, his wife has been unfaithful to him.
Right.
The end.
No genies.
Yeah. And now, that's not what you call a big narrative engine, you know.
No.
And yet, you know, his way of telling the story is so extraordinary that it becomes, you know, one of the greatest novels ever written. But I've always thought, my way of thinking about it is that if you're going to build a big car, you should put a big engine in it. You know, and story is the engine. You know? And I've always thought that there are a lot of books which are underpowered because they don't have that narrative drive. But in the 18th century, the 19th century, in those great moments of the novel, the great writers never forgot to tell stories. You know, I mean, Dickens is crowded with stories. And so is Thackeray, and so is, you know, all of those writers. So I'm very interested in I see there's no reason at all why storytelling and literature should be separated from each other. And I think one of the things I've tried to do is to, you know, is to use story as as the driving force.
Well, and beyond the fantastical component, though, in this book, there is a deep philosophical war also playing out among two figures in the book who kind of actually, the characters that we meet subsequently are almost Midnight's children-like figures who descend from these two original figures, which are actually historical figures from Islamic history. Two philosophers with dueling visions of how to deal with the world. Can you talk about those two figures?
Yeah, I mean, they were supposed to be really minor characters, and they kind of got out of control, and insisted on being more important. And originally, the book has this prologue in the 12th century in Arab-controlled Spain, Andalusia, and I thought in this prologue two things would happen. One is that one of the philosophers, the philosopher known in the West as Averroes and whose real name was Ibn Rushd, from which my name derives, that he would have this fall in love with this girl who he didn't realize, but she's actually a supernatural being. She's a jinn princess. And they have children, a lot of children, sometimes 19 at a time. And yet he's so self-absorbed that he doesn't realize that she might be something a little out of the ordinary. So that's one thing, and those children and the descendants of those children in our century become the main characters of the novel. And the other thing that was going to happen is that he would have this argument with this other philosopher. Ibn Rushd was in his time, a very progressive-minded philosopher who was the greatest, perhaps the greatest ever commentator on the works of Aristotle. And was a great believer in Aristotelian virtues of reason and logic and scientific method. And what he wanted to do was to incorporate those things into Islamic philosophy. And against him was the figure of Al-Ghazali, who was a much more conservative thinker. And that argument, in a way, is still going on. And I think that's why they ended up not shutting up when they died in my book. Unusual for people to go on arguing 900 years after they die. But that's sort of what happened. Because I began, once I had that argument going on in the book, in this prologue, I thought they were too much fun to dump. I thought I was kind of enjoying them too much. And B, I thought, in a way, this argument is still continuing. And so I wanted to think, then I thought, but how do I allow them to go on having the argument when they're dead? And the answer is, of course, fiction lets you do a lot of things. And, ghosts can have arguments too. And so they become this sort of motif that crops up. I mean, they're still secondary characters, but they now crop up a few times.
And the War of the Worlds, as it's described in the book, is a war between between reason and unreason, as you describe it.
Well, what the book suggests is that the book begins, or the modern part of the book begins, with a huge storm, a kind of super Hurricane Sandy. And this storm, it suggests, is so powerful that it breaks open the seals which separate our world from the world of these supernatural beings, the jinn. And the jinn pour through the cracks, and some of them are really very bad and want to take over. And they're very powerful. One of them, they also can become very large. One of them eats the Staten Island ferry at one point.
I really liked, by the way, you did a TV interview where you were riding the Staten Island ferry, describing what it would feel like to be eaten on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually with Jeff from PBS, who I saw today, we were reminiscing about how we failed to be eaten on the Staten Island ferry. But anyway, so the dark jinn, invade the world, and they have enormous powers, and they can take over the control of minds of many people and so on. And then Dunya, who is the good jinn, the princess with whom Ibn Rushd had all these children, kind of returns to the world to try and save the world, to try and save her children. And so there's this war. And one of the things that is really quite strange is that when I started writing this book, which is now, it's close to 5 years ago that I started writing it, and nobody had ever heard of ISIS. At that time, Isis was the name of an Egyptian goddess. And that was all. And so when I started describing this war taking place in what the novel calls Mesopotamia, but what we know better as Iraq, there was no such war taking place. And then just as I was getting to the end of the novel, it started happening. And that was alarming. I would like my books to stop coming true.
But given the memoir that you've just written and the fact that you have a history with religion, and have you found that exploring it in fiction presents you a new? Did you mean to explore sort of a debate internally within religion and forces of secularism?
I mean, it's one of the things that happens in the book. But I think there's something sort of under that. I mean, the book has as a frontispiece to the book, there's the famous etching of Goya's, which is known as "The Sleep of Reason Brings Forth Monsters." But what is interesting is in his commentary on that picture, he said something more complicated. Because when you look at the picture, you think what you're being told is that reason is good and unreason is bad. But in his commentary, he says something more nuanced, if you like. He says that when reason and fantasy come together, then, to paraphrase, then they become a great creative force, and they're the parents of the arts and so on. But when they're torn apart from each other, it's when the kind of monstrous aspects begin to emerge. So I really took that as my cue to say I want to write about a world which is not just opposing these two forces, but trying to say that when they come together, they are creative, and when they take it apart, they're destructive. So the novel begins with a man of reason falling in love with a creature of fantasy, and their union produces all these children who become the novel, if you like. So that sort of, in a way, shows the creative force of the union of these things. And then there's this war, which is an illustration of the opposite. So it's trying to say both those things. And yes, of course, one of the ways it says it is to talk about what we all know to be going on in the world right now. And as I say, I wanted it to feel like a contemporary novel. I wanted people reading the novel to be able to hear echoes with the modern world. The period of the novel is, I thought of it as being set in New York like the day after tomorrow, because I didn't want to worry about who the mayor was.
Yeah.
Actually, the mayor of New York in the novel is a woman, which is not actually the case, unfortunately. But it's, other than that kind of detail, it really is supposed to be the city as it is now, but in which very strange things have started happening. And in the novel, it's called The Time of the Strangenesses.
Right.
And and even though the strangenesses in the novel are kind of surrealist strangenesses, really, I think we live in that time. I think we live in a time in which the rate of transformation and the radical nature of transformation is, both the world is changing both very extremely and at very high speed. And that strangeness, that alienation that I think many of us would consequently feel, is kind of the mood in which the book is set.
And now you've stopped tweeting recently because you were tweeting quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm not doing. I'm done.
Okay.
Yeah.
And why are you done?
I don't know. It's sometimes you wake up in the morning and you look to your right and there's somebody sleeping there and you think, I don't love you anymore.
So that was Twitter for you.
Yeah. That little blue bird. I thought, I don't love you anymore.
But it was you responding to a lot of the strangenesses around us. You've taken, you have a pretty public view of one of our candidates for president, and you were tweeting quite regularly.
Which one? No, the thing is, I think it's very well named Twitter. It is this kind of twittering noise in your ear. And there was just a moment at which I thought, I don't want this noise in my ear anymore. And I just stopped. And I haven't missed it for a second, I'd say. I've had to leave the account alive, because if I delete the account, somebody will cyber squat my name within 5 seconds and will then be tweeting as if they're me, and I don't want that. So the account is alive, but I'm just stopping. Just enough. I'm just going to do this old-fashioned thing.
Write novels.
Writing books, yeah.
You know,
And, you know, I remember, like, a couple of years ago, Jonathan Franzen made a series of statements in which he expressed his dislike of social media. And at one point, he even said, I don't know why Salman does it, because I thought he was too smart for that. And then everybody tried to make a fight between him and me, but actually, you know, we get on very well. And I said, you know, I completely understand what he's saying. And I understand not wanting that noise in your head when you're working. And I said, I'm just trying this out. I'm trying it out to see what it is, you know. And I've now more or less come round to the Franzen position. I think I'm just going to do what I do, and I don't need all these peripheral things.
but I mean, you have always. I mean, you had this incredible collection of essays that you published, Step Across This Line, which came out of a series of things that you were responding to, from political events to world events. There was a really interesting talk you gave about news and the media, and the fact that, you know, we're all fiction writers now. You say that we have characters in the news which are novelistic. And do you still feel that way? Do you look at, sort of, as you read the news, do you see now an age of fiction in our nonfiction?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not the first person to suggest that we live in a post-factual age. You know? But I think one of the presidential candidates is an expert in that. You know? And nobody cares. You know, I mean, he goes on TV and lies 25 times a day, and nobody cares. It doesn't affect him. It's as if we've stopped being interested in whether things are true or not. You know, I mean, Stephen Colbert invented that wonderful word, truthiness. You know, and we now live in the age of truthiness. You could say anything you want, and if it sounds kind of truthy, people will not actually worry about whether it's true. Truthy is good enough. And that's very worrying to live in a time when people have become detached from the idea that the truth is important. You know, speaking as a writer of fiction, that's very important, because we need to be able to tell the difference between truth and lies. Lies are my job.
You've also, though, been quite critical of people on the left and of sort of a kind of culture of cultural relativity, you know, relativism and political correctness, etc. And we're also living on the flip side, it seems to me, in a new age of identity politics as well, and of the question of representation and who speaks for whom and who's able to, you know, you have this great line of beware of the new behalfism, of people who claim to speak on behalf of a certain community. And yet it feels like on one side, on the left, we're having a lot of debates about representation. And I wonder what you think of that.
Well, it's too big a question, really. I mean, I think it is a very big question, and
Yeah.
it has a lot to do with the novel that I'm trying to write now. So you might have to, we might have to come back in a couple of years. But I do think that, you know, I'll just say one thing about it, which is that it seems to me that the thrust of a lot of contemporary identity politics is to ask us to define ourselves in increasingly narrow ways. That we have to be very specific things, you know. That's true in politics, it's true in gender politics, it's true in race politics, it's true everywhere. We are being asked to define ourselves more narrowly. And the trouble with that is that the more narrowly we define ourselves, the easier it is to find ourselves at odds with other people. You know, whereas one of the things that the novel as a form has always known is that human beings are very, very plural people. We are not singular, we are plural. And we are contradictory. You know, I mean, as Walt Whitman famously said, you know, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. And that's what the novel is like. It shows that a human character is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous and contradictory. So, you know, anybody in this room could probably make a couple of dozen statements that would be, all of them would be equally a definition of identity. They could define themselves as, for example, tall, or supporters of a certain baseball team, or as the parents of their children, or as people who do a certain kind of job, or in terms of whatever their religious orientation or lack of it might be. I mean, there's a whole range of things you can say about yourself, and all of them are true. And if you accept that you are all those things, then it becomes easier to find points of overlap with other people. You can have strong political disagreements with somebody, but support the same football team. You know, it's just much easier. When you see human character as plural, it becomes much easier to see points of contact with other people. And the more you have to say, you know, I am Western, I am Muslim, etc. That's how to create conflict. You know, and I think that's the problem with a lot of, and it's not even in the West versus Islam. I mean, in India right now, you know, the desire to push people into kind of narrow community definitions, you know, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, whatever, is also creating conflict there. So I worry about this whole area of identity politics because it seems to me to not understand something very profound about human nature, which is that our identities are not singular, they are plural. And the novel has always known this. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why people should read novels, because it tells them something that they're not hearing enough.
And you've said it's the age of frontiers that we live in, that it's the time the people, you know, one of the sort of goals of your creative project has been to explore the idea of those who step across lines, those who don't see frontiers.
Yeah, I'm the kind of opposite of, I don't want to build walls. Let's put it that way. Let alone get Mexico to pay for them.
Strategic.
I would like somebody to ask him how. Just how. Anyway.
But do you think?
But I think that, I mean, look, I'm a migrant, you know. I mean, I have spent my life bouncing across the world. And that started off in India, spent a long time in England, now almost 20 years in America. And my life has been defined by that act of movement, you know, and I'm grateful for it, and I think it's been something which has created the kind of artist that I have become. And I think, on the whole, this age, which is an age of migration, has been very enriching, both for the communities to which migrants come and to the migrants who come to those communities. You know, all you have to do is walk down the streets of any great city in the world now, and you have the stories of the whole world bumping into each other on the streets, and that seems to me much richer than some kind of narrow, pure culture. I'm on the whole not a great fan of the idea of cultural purity. I think when people start talking about cultural purity, other people start dying. You know, I mean, Hitler was somebody who talked about cultural purity. I'm in favor of dirt, you know, cultural impurity. Let's have a lot of just dirt mixed in there. Then people, first of all, people tend to stay alive, and that's probably good.
To the risk of asking another possibly too big a question, if novels are meant to show us how not to allow ourselves to be confined by that kind of purity, are our artists in some way not addressing these questions enough? Are they not emphasizing this kind of multiplicity enough? No,
I'm not going to say that. I mean, I think, you know, I think if we talk about the art of the novel, I think it's a very, very rich time in world literature for a start. I think it's a very rich time in American literature, and precisely for this reason, which is that American literature has always been inspired by and enabled by migration. You know, Eastern European Jewish migration, Italian migration, all of that has fed directly into the mainstream of American literature. Now, in the generation much younger than mine, there are new American writers from really almost everywhere in the world. You know, there's Junot Diaz from the Dominican Republic, there's Jhumpa Lahiri from South Asia, there's Yi-Yun Lee from China, there's Nam Le from Vietnam, there's any number of people coming from all over the world, they and their families coming from all over the world with different stories in their luggage, you know, and unpacking that luggage and allowing those stories to escape into American literature, you know, and become a part of American literature. And I think it has been incredibly enriching of this generation of American writers. And in a way, this book is in part inspired by those young writers, because I thought, I can do that. You know, I thought I've got stuff in my luggage too. Maybe I should unpack those suitcases and get out some of that stuff and throw it at the Chrysler Building and see what happens. And no, I genuinely think that this generation of new migrant stories arriving in American literature is one of the best things to happen to American literature for a long time.
Well, it's an interesting time for you to say that, too, because you've recently become an American citizen yourself.
Oh, yeah, I get to vote now.
Yeah. And so you are an American novelist.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Amongst other things.
Right. You've often written about your love of cinema and how the movies kind of made you a writer, and it was The Wizard of Oz specifically. Is that right?
Well, I mean, yeah, that was one. But I mean, no, I just grew up, I grew up in Bombay. I mean, Bombay is a city obsessed with the movies. Obsessed with the movies. And so it's impossible to grow up there without having that in your bloodstream. And I mean, I had people in my family who were in small ways involved in the movies. I mean, I had 2 aunts who acted in the movies and uncle who wrote screenplays and so on. And the movies are everywhere. And yeah, The Wizard of Oz just had I wrote a story, I saw The Wizard of Oz and I wrote a story called Over the Rainbow, about a boy who finds the beginning of the rainbow and walks over it. Anyway, I thought it was pretty good. My father lost it.
No.
Yeah, my father said, you won't be able to look after it, I'll look after it.
Uh-oh.
And then he lost it. And I thought, The Wizard of Oz actually is, to an extent, it's a story about the incompetence of adults. Aunt Em and Uncle Henry can't save Toto from Miss Gulch. They're useless, When Dorothy gets to the wizard is useless. Right. The wizard is a phony. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, So the grown-ups in the story are pathetic. And Dorothy has to become the adult because of the incompetence of adults. So the fact that my father lost the story about the Wizard of Oz is completely appropriate to the theme of the Wizard of Oz. But no, I mean, I think I was very lucky that when I was young, the years I was at college, I was in Cambridge from the mid-60s, 65 to 8. I mean, there's a period from, roughly speaking, the late 1950s to the early 1970s, which we now think of as the golden age of the sound cinema, and it's very difficult to explain to people what it felt like when what we now think of as masterpieces were that week's new movie. So one week it would be, La Dolce Vita. And the next week it would be a new Godard film, and then a new Truffaut film, and then a new Pasolini film, and then a new Ingmar Bergman film, and then a new Satyajit Ray film, and then a new Luis Buñuel film. Week after week after week, it was dazzling to go to the cinema. And I think I learned at least as much in the movie theater as I did in a library. There was this little theater in Cambridge called the Arts Cinema, which, like everything else, no longer exists, and now it's a coffee shop. But I feel I got my education in that little room. Watching, You know, Godard's Alphaville, and Truffaut's Jules Légime, and Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, and Luis Buñuel's Exterminating Angel, and so on, you know. And I think those things have a colossal, this book is incredibly influenced by those films.
And does the so-called golden age of television inspire you as well? Are you watching a lot of those series?
I'm interested because it's clear that this new form of the 60-minute drama series, there is something novelistic about it. That the length of time you have available allows you to do what is difficult to do in film, which allows you to have time to develop character, to have many different storylines. I mean, you think of something like Game of Thrones, there's an unbelievable number of storylines in there. I mean, I wonder how people keep them all in their heads, but it works, you know. So there's something novelistic about this. And yeah, I'm interested.
But it isn't the novel, right? I mean,
I mean, no, nothing is the novel. The novel is the novel.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And one of the great things about the novel, you know, is that everything, almost since the birth of the novel, people have been predicting the death of the novel, you know? And every single new thing that comes along is supposed to kill the novel. You know, radio is supposed to kill the novel. Cinema, television, you know, the internet, everything is supposed to kill the novel, and yet, you know, the novel obstinately refuses to die. And I'll tell you why. It's because people like it. You know, things. I mean, very interesting what happened. You know, the e-books, they were supposed to kill the novel. So they arrived, e-books, and they went like a rocket, boom, like that, you know, and everybody, including everybody in the publishing industry, panicked. And they got to about 17, 18% of the market, and they completely plateaued. And now they're actually dropping, whereas the sales of this dinosaur of an object, the hardcover novel, sales are going up. You know, bookstores were going out of business. Now there's little indication that bookstores are beginning to open rather than close, you know, so. So, you know, here's this, I had to go and give a talk at Google, you know, in Mountain View, California. And I mean, it's an audience as big as this, but entirely composed of 21-year-old techies. And I mean, very smart kids. And I said to them, you know, this is a very remarkable piece of sophisticated hardware. I said, you know, what happens if you drop your laptop in the bath? It's screwed. So if you drop that in the bath, it does not lose its data. You know, you just have to dry it out.
Right.
What happens if you pour sand on a computer? Not good for it. So you can read this stuff, this thing, you can read it in the bath, you can read it at the beach, you could read it in places where people like to read. Also, if you're in the beach and it's sunny, you look at your Kindle, the screen, you can't read the screen because it's too bright. This is not, the text doesn't disappear in bright sunlight. You know? So this is actually more sophisticated, you know.
More adaptive.
And also, it doesn't become obsolete. The thing about computers, which were supposed to be this wonderful new thing, is they become obsolete at incredibly high speed. What's a floppy disk? You know? If 20 years ago, if you were saving your data on a floppy disk, you couldn't use it anymore. You know? This, 20 years ago, you could have a book that's 20 years old, you could still read it perfectly easily. Doesn't need to be translated into some other technology that will be obsolete in 5 years' time. You know? So you see, this is more sophisticated. And that's why it survives. It's you know, you don't need all those, they call them campuses. You know,
The Google campus.
Google, Microsoft, all of that. They're called campuses. You don't need those places. You just need, you know, one person sitting in a room scribbling.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm sure many people have many questions. So please, I think we should open this up to the audience. There are mic stands in both of the aisles. And yes, preferably questions and not statements would be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Okay. So you said that in drawing the distinction between the person who sits down to write a novel and the person who takes to Twitter, that there sort of needs to be truths so that the novelist can essentially make up a certain form of lies, right? So in a world where truth and reality are becoming increasingly fictionalized, what is it that's left for the novelist to do? Or how are the fabrications of the novelist supposed to differ from the fabrications of the Twitter user or the spectacularized politician?
Well, it's a question, there's no doubt. I mean, the answer is you've got to deal with it, I think what happens is the world changes all the time and the novel has to change with it. And one of the things that's happened now is that reality, or what we consider to be reality, has become very contested. There isn't an agreement about what it is. Whereas if you think about the great heyday of the novel, think about, the 19th century novel, the 19th century realist novel, that was based essentially on the knowledge that the writer had, that the writer and the reader would basically have the same picture of the world. They would basically see the world in the same way as being the same thing. And out of that agreement between the writer and the reader came the realist tradition. It's built on that agreement. But if you now live in a time in which reality has become incredibly contested and disputed and messed around with, it's very hard to write that kind of realist novel because that agreement no longer exists. So you have to think of different forms. I mean, that's what I think many of us are wrestling with.
Sir, thank you for being here. Might you be willing to mentor young people, perhaps through the Rolex mentorship program? I was wondering, I know Anis Kapoor has participated. Have you participated with that?
They never asked me.
We'll make it happen then. Okay.
I mean, every so often I've been asked if I would be willing to be asked. It's a kind of meta question. And I have expressed a desire, I have said that I would be willing to be asked and I would be willing to consider answering.
I'm going to send an email back.
Okay, but they actually never have asked me. I mean, I do my bit of teaching and so on. I mean, I'm interested in the company of young, smart minds, and one of the things that's a great pleasure, and I teach a little bit at NYU, and to sit around with very smart people talking about very good books feels like pleasure, and then they give you money for it. So.
I'm a smart young person and I would love to be in your company. So my question is, a college student at a time of political correctness, social justice warriors, trigger warnings, professors who ask you to stop believing in the purest form of free speech and stop raising your voice and sharing your opinions because they're controversial. How does a student broaden their horizons and gain the most they can from the money they're paying to college?
Yeah, well, I'll say two things. One is that I dislike all of that little list that you just made. But secondly, I would say I don't think it's as big a problem as it's sometimes made out to be. I've been teaching in the American Academy now for a very long time. I was teaching on and off at Emory College in Atlanta for 10 years. I'm now at NYU, and I have literally never had a student come up to me and express a desire for a trigger warning or a safe space or any of these things. It's never happened. And so I think if it were to happen, I would have a very clear answer, which is that the university is a place where you must be exposed to ideas you have not had before and some of which you might not like. That's what you're there for. and that the only safe space they can be in a university is a safe space for ideas, not a safe space from ideas. You know? And if you can't stomach that, then maybe you shouldn't be at university. Maybe you should be working at the KFC or something. You know, because really that's why people go to college. They go to college to learn how to think. And you cannot learn how to think unless you're exposed to thinking which is not the thinking you already have. But as I say, this is the debate that's happening a lot, I know. And I know some instances which have been very difficult. But in my personal experience, I've never come across it. And certainly at NYU, I've been talking to my fellow members of the faculty. They don't come across it that much, you know. So, I mean, there are some very weird things which we all know because they've been in the newspapers. There was this event at Mount Holyoke College a couple of years ago when at Mount Holyoke they would every year do a production, a staged reading of Eve Ensler's Vagina Monologues. And then a couple of years ago there was a protest from the left, by the way, against the play. This famous feminist text was criticized because it defined women as people with vaginas and therefore discriminated against women who did not have vaginas. And because of this, the production was cancelled. Now, that's an example of where this identity politics thing can go. But as I say, I don't think this is as huge an issue in my experience, as people are making it, and maybe there's already a student backlash against it. You know, that students don't want it either, I hope.
For you, what was the hardest aspect of storytelling to tackle, and how did you approach it?
Everything's hard. I mean, it's not easy. You know, if it was easy, everybody would do it. And that would be awful, because then... Well, look, the hardest thing is to say something interesting. You know? And the great gamble of writing is that you don't know if what you think is interesting will be interesting to anyone else. You know, I mean, I remember when I finished writing Midnight's Children all those years ago, I remember thinking to myself, you know, I think this is a good book, I thought. I had absolutely nobody knew who I was. I was completely unknown as a writer. And I was completely uncertain whether anybody would agree with my assessment of it. You know, I mean, I think it's a good book, but supposing nobody else does, then what? And that's really the gamble of art, you know, is that you do this thing which when you're doing it feels like a very private act. You're sitting by yourself in a room for 5 years. It took me 5 years to write that book. And really it's just you and the book, that's all there is. You know? And then at the end of it, you send it out of the room and suddenly this private act becomes a public act. And you have to hope that somebody gets it. You know, and that's the gamble, and you never know if it's going to work. And when it works, it's pretty damn good. When it doesn't work, it's horrible. And I can't say more than that, really. I mean, it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do, writing, but it's also the most rewarding.
Since you brought up Midnight's Children, I had a little bit of a question about that. You, of course, always talk about your debt to the authors that came before you. And, of course, we see that very much in this novel. You bring up Gogol's nose, I think, is in there. And you're very comfortable, it seems, with referencing other authors. I was wondering about the end of Midnight's Children. I read it and thought it sounded very much like the end of Villette, only in reverse. And I wondered at all if that had come into your mind at all while reading it.
Villette of Charlotte Bronte? Mm-hmm. Oh, no, no. That's actually, I'm going to pretend that I knew that. so the next time anybody asks me that question, I'll say, oh, yeah, sure, Charlotte Bronte.
It sounded like the mirror, like
No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean, but no. No, I mean, alas, I wish I was smart enough to have thought of that.
All right, thank you.
My favorite question of all time was when Midnight's Children first came out. I was talking at a university in Delhi, and the young woman stood up and she said, "Your novel, Mr. Rushdie, Midnight's Children, it's a very long novel." She said, "Never mind, I read it through."
That was the question.
She said, "My question for you is the following." She said, "Fundamentally, what's your point?"
Best question ever.
I've been trying to answer that ever since.
Yes, I have a question not related so much to being a novelist, but certainly literature. You recently espoused the memorization of poetry as a way of, as a technique for teaching. And being that I'm a school teacher, I'm fascinated by that. We've gotten very far away from memorization of any kind. And you basically refer to it as a lost art. I happen to like Kipling and other forms of poetry, but it doesn't really matter. I've always just enjoyed that for my leisure. And when I was a young man, we did memorize things like the Gettysburg Address and whatnot, and anything, that we thought was related to civics, basically, and even some dates. So could you explain how that you think, I know you basically, I think of you as an educator, as like I am, obviously, and so I would like to hear your views on memorization of poetry.
Well, I come from that generation where we were all asked to do it, and it's very annoying. When you're having to sit by yourself and try and memorize, especially when it's a poem you don't particularly like, which at school it often is, But the fact is that a lot of that poetry has still stayed with me, and I still have it in my head as a way of thinking about things, and I feel it's a real resource, And not all of it is great poetry. I can still recite the whole of The Walrus and the Carpenter, for example. Don't ask me, otherwise I will. I just think it's a way of training the mind. First of all, it allows you to understand beauty in a way that you don't understand unless you have it at your fingertips. If you have a poem there in your head for you to think about, you can appreciate it in a way that you don't on the page. When the page becomes irrelevant because it's inside you, that's a different sort of experience. And I just think it's an enriching experience, although I admit, annoying. and children, young people very often complain about being asked to rote learning is something. And it's also unfashionable, which is its second great advantage.
That's right. Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think it's a good thing. And I know everyone I know who spent their childhood being made to learn things speaks well of the experience, says that they're glad they did and that they feel happy to have those things in their head. And not everything stays in your head, but, some stuff does. And it's worth it. It's worth it. It gives you a frame of reference which is broader than you would otherwise have.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for asking such thoughtful questions. I don't have a question about literature per se, but about the cultural purity thing. I'm curious to hear what you think is going to be the case for Indian writers in India, like what that environment will look like with the rise of the BJP, and especially like what's really been happening and all of what Modi is saying. And on top of that, do you think we're going to see more self-censorship from writers in India, or I'm just curious what you think.
I really have to, my problem is that I have not been to India since the Modi government took power. So I'm looking from a distance, and I've always been very suspicious of people who talk about India from a distance. So I don't want to be the person doing it, I was always an opponent of Narendra Modi from way back, from when he was just running Gujarat. I think he's a very alarming figure, and I think his government is a very alarming government. And I do think it's frightening for people. Self-censorship, I can't tell. I mean, self-censorship seems to me to be the greatest crime that a writer can commit. I mean, if you feel that scared, then don't write. Nobody's asking you to write. And if by writing you can only write by saying something which is less than the truth, then, for goodness sake, save the trees. There are plenty of good books around for us to read. We don't have to read second-rate books. I don't know of any writer of my acquaintance who is too chicken to say what they think. But what I do know is that it is very frightening in India right now, and there's lots of bullying going on, and lots of menaces. And I don't want to say more than that because I haven't been there, so I don't have my kind of boots on the ground knowledge of what's going on, but I'm very worried about it.
Unfortunately, we probably only have time for one or two more questions, so
All
sorry.
right. So my question is about freedom of speech, about which you talk. So some of your critics say that you are selective about talking about freedom of speech. Like
That I'm what, sorry?
Like you are being selective about the freedom of speech.
Selective.
So what do you say to that?
You'll have to say a bit more.
So I was saying, like in India, you don't talk about how the international corporates go over there, or the national corporates, and they censor the media and all those things. So you don't talk about that. Some of your critics say
Well, first of all, it's not required to talk about everything. You know what I mean? Freedom of speech is the right to speak about what you want to talk about. And I'm not obliged to talk about anything. I talk about the things I want to talk about. But the point I'm trying to make is that the value of this thing is that it is the freedom on which all other freedoms depend. If you don't have free expression, you don't actually have a free society. So that's why it's valuable. I mean, people are completely free to disapprove of what I say or to disapprove of the things I don't talk about. Fair enough, That's not the point I'm making. I don't have to make a speech on every subject in the world in order to prove that I believe in free speech. I talk about what I want to talk about and let other people talk about what they want to talk about. That's the point. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we can probably take one last question. I'm sorry to everybody else who's in line.
Good evening. A simple question, perhaps provoking a non-simple answer. From where do you get your deepest inspiration?
Oh, yeah. There's a store. And but you have to know the password.
Very good, very good.
No, I mean, if I knew the answer to that question, I would have written a lot more books. It's very difficult to say where a book comes from, and in my experience, it doesn't come in the same way twice. Every book comes in a different way. Sometimes you have a storyline, sometimes you have a character, sometimes you have fragments that you gradually understand how they fit together. The great American novelist Joseph Heller, who wrote Catch-22, amongst other books, used to say that what happened with him characteristically is that he would think of a sentence and he would know that that sentence contained another 200 sentences. So that, his second novel, Something Happened, originally began with the sentence, "In the office in which I work, there are 5 people of whom I'm afraid." Then he knew how to write the book. That happened to me once. That happened when I wrote Haroun in the Sea of Stories, which I was having some trouble with the tone of voice of that book, about how to make it not too grown up for children and not too childish for grown-ups, And then there was a day when I sat there and wrote the first sentence. There was once in the country of Alif Bay, sad city, saddest of cities, a city so sad that it had forgotten its name. I thought, okay, now I know how to write the book. Literally, I wrote that sentence, and it was like an open sesame.
Wow.
I thought, okay, got it. And so, yeah, it comes in many different ways.
Thank you.
Could we take one or two more questions, or I don't know. Is that okay? Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, oops. It's not in true the person asking the question.
Can't hear. No.
Okay. Oh, wow. First of all, I'd like to just say it's such an honor for me to have a chance to ask you a question, so thank you so much for being here. Second, since you talked about movies, I have a twofold question. First, if you have one, what's your favorite Bollywood movie? And second, would you like to see some of your novels be made into movies, or do you think they'll lose their essence while being made in movies? Thank you.
Well, you know, when I was growing up in Bombay, it was not called Bollywood. Bollywood is a more recent invention. We used to just call them Bombay talkies, sometimes they were called, movies. My favorite films all come from that old period. I like Shri 420, Mr. 420 is one of my favorite films. And my favorite song, unsurprisingly, is the song about Bombay, which is called Bombay Meri Jaan, Bombay My Darling. So
it's a great song.
This will mean only something to those of you.
And your novels as films.
Yeah. And Midnight's Children was made into a film by the Indian-Canadian director Deepa Mehta, and I wrote the screenplay, and so I'm biased, but I thought it was quite good. But one of the things I was interested in the finished film was that its tone of voice is rather different than the novel. I think the novel is funnier and sort of wilder than the film, but the film is much more directly emotional than the novel. And I mean, I kind of like it that they have that difference, that the film really is Deepa's work, responding to my work. And so, yeah, I like it. I mean, I would like all of them to be filmed, but there doesn't seem to be a stampede.
Hi. So I come from the country, another country than Bilal, I believe, where your work, unfortunately, was not allowed to be read to the extent that we could go to jail or be killed by mob. However, my parents made the fortunate choice of not leaving that country and going after the black market and getting your books and going through the process. So that's just one point. So
no, I very well respect.
Given what's going on in this country, unfortunately, Bilal, I think you may want to renew your roots a little bit. But my question to Mr. Rushdie, if I may, is as an international or as a non-American, the candidate that you so dislike, perhaps, from what he's saying, it seems as a non-American that he probably would be a lot more or a lot less interventionist than the usual lot, if you know what I'm trying to say, in terms of and holding the leaders of the area that I come from more accountable, perhaps, than the other candidates. I'm just curious, what's your view from an international perspective regarding the U.S. elections?
Well, I think the only world leaders that I've heard Mr. Trump refer to with admiration are all dictators. Putin, Assad, these are the people he likes. And I worry about that being the principle of foreign policy. But, long before he intervenes in any other country, he's going to intervene in this one. And frankly, my worries begin right here at home. I cannot imagine a Trump-appointed Supreme Court, which is what would happen. We'd have an extremely authoritarian Supreme Court for the rest of my life, certainly for a generation. I'm unable to take Trump seriously as a candidate except as a figure of fear. So it is my hope that he will be defeated. And so we will not have to have this conversation.
We have some younger readers who have a question for you, and I want to give them the chance to ask you. Okay.
Okay, yes.
Me and my sister were wondering, where'd you get the inspiration for Haroon and the Sea of Stories?
Well, part of it, my older son's middle name is Haroon. At the time the book came out, he was annoyed that I didn't use his first name. Now I think he's quite relieved. And the book began because when he was a little boy, I used to tell him stories in the bath, when he was in the bath. Not bedtime stories, but bath time stories. And I would pretend to him that the bath water contained the stories. So I would dip a little cup in the bath water and pretend to take a sip and then tell him a story. So I said, that, the bath is full of stories. And so from that bath full of stories, it became a sea of stories. And it began with my son in the bath. That's how it started. Some of it comes out of Kashmir because, as I said, it's where my family's from. The book is, I think anyone who has any knowledge of Kashmir can see that the fictional country in the story is pretty clearly based on Kashmir. So like that's some of it. Does that help?
I think we can take one last question. I'm sorry, but that will be it.
Hi. I read your book, Joseph Anton, and about that very difficult period of time you went through when you were in hiding and your life was being threatened and you were actually separated from your son and your family much of that time. And I just wondered what strength you were able to rely on from yourself to get through that period of time, which was a long time, like 10 years.
More than 10 years, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I was very fortunate in that I was surrounded by incredibly loyal friends and family. And had it not been for their strength, I would probably have had much greater difficulty in surviving that experience. But I did fortunately have around me this circle of very, very brave and very loyal people, and that was a great help. And then there's a thing which relates to this book. In this book, there are these characters who are supposedly the descendants of the jinn and have a little bit of the jinn magic, inside them, which when the crisis comes, when the great war comes, they discover that power within themselves that they're able to use to resist the attack against them. And what I was trying to say there is something that I learned in those years, which is I think many of us, maybe all of us, have within ourselves unsuspected strength, unsuspected reserves of strength that we, in ordinary life, have no need to call upon and we're maybe not even aware of. But in a time of crisis, whatever that crisis may be, many of us face crises in our family, crises of health, crises of all sorts of things. And I think what very often happens is that when the crisis comes, we discover in ourselves the strength to face it, and we surprise ourselves in our ability to resist whatever it is that's coming at us. And I certainly thought, if you had asked me at the beginning of that period, if you had said it's going to be like 11 years of your life and what sort of shape do you think you're going to be in at the end, I would not have bet on myself to be in great shape. But I, as I say, with the help of the other people, I also found, I found that I was more bloody-minded than I thought I was. I found that I had survival capacities which were greater than I believed I did. And as I say, I think that's not just me. I think that is a characteristic we have, that when the crisis comes, we find in ourselves the resources to deal with it. And that's what I did, and I think that's what many people do.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
And on that note, thank you so much for being here this evening and for the sea of stories that you've given us. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.